Well, Donald Trump there in the White House with his cabinet, striking what sounded like a bit more of a conciliatory tone. He talked about it all going to work out, but we have, of course, seen the markets rallying yesterday in the US, but today wavering slightly as a threat of a trade war between China and the US continues to threaten global economics. Well, let's bring in our correspondent who's in Washington for us, shall we, David Blevins. You were watching Donald Trump there. To me, it sounded like he was striking perhaps a bit more of a conciliatory tone. What did you think?
Yes, it was slightly more conciliatory. Around the world, we went in the space of 90 minutes. Another very lengthy press conference mid-cabinet meeting covering everything from the state of the markets to the potential for trade deals to his hopes in relation to the talks with Iran taking place this weekend and his hopes for a ceasefire in Ukraine. But of course, much of the time was taken up with questions about what's going on in the markets as a result of his tariffs policy. He described yesterday as the biggest day in the history of the markets, but used one word rather negatively 3 times. The president spoke about transition difficulties, transition costs, transition problems. Now, he never quite got to the point of defining what he meant by transition, but the only transition I can think of is the one between tariffs being imposed and tariffs being paused then yesterday. Now, he said it's all going to work out well. He didn't take any responsibility at all for the chaos we've witnessed in the markets. Instead, when he got a question about what happened this morning, the drop in the US markets, he deferred to his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who said they were up 10, down 5, not a bad ratio, and he didn't see anything unusual today. He also then deferred to his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, who said they really didn't have enough hours in the day to deal with the more than 75 countries who are knocking on the door, he claims, seeking a trade deal. The president was asked about how soon some of those deals could take place. He said, I could do it in one day if I want to, but they've got to be good deals. And I think we heard for the first time that he's considering bringing in lawyers from external law firms to help those who now have just 90 days to try and negotiate some of those deals.
And you talk there about good deals that he talks about. How high up the list do you think the UK is?
I think the UK is fairly high up the list. He seems to have a good relationship with Keir Starmer and doesn't seem to want to damage that relationship. We saw how flattered he was when the Prime Minister arrived at the White House and presented him with that invitation for a state visit, an unprecedented state visit to the UK. He hasn't specified, although he was asked today, where countries sit on that list, how far up the queue, for example, the UK might be. He did talk a little about the EU, but at the end of the day, he says he doesn't blame China for the problems in terms of the trade deficit, and he doesn't blame the EU. So presumably he doesn't blame the UK either. Instead, he says he blames former presidents, those who occupied the Oval Office before him. But it sounds like he is holding firm to his position in relation to his policy of imposing tariffs in due course if there has not been successful negotiations with those who, we're told, are ringing the White House every 5 minutes hoping to have a deal.
OK, David Blevins for us in Washington there. Thank you very much for giving us the very latest. Right, let's bring in our political correspondent, Rob Powell. In fact, we're going to come back to Rob Powell because you're watching the Politics Hub. There's lots to come this evening. I'll be speaking to the former Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, shortly. But now let's bring in our duo for this evening, the former Home Office Minister, Tom Pursglove, and the Director of the Good Growth Foundation and Labour Council, Praful Nargund. And also Rob Powell. Sorry, I sort of semi-teased you there, Rob, but Rob Powell is with us. Rob, we'll start with you and then we'll speak to our panel in a moment. You've been with the Prime Minister all day. He seems to be kind of sticking to the same line, keep cool, carry on when it comes to any agreement with the US.
Yeah, he's been in Cambridgeshire, the police HQ there, ostensibly talking about neighbourhood policing, but clearly, as often happens with some of these visits around the country, other issues crowd in. So when we spoke to him a little bit earlier, tariffs was high on the agenda, but also some of the concern that's been coming from Labour MPs over what inquiries are going on into the grooming gang scandal. This is what he told me. Donald Trump has backed down on some of his tariff plans, seemingly in the face of rising borrowing costs in the States. Has the president done a Liz Truss on the global economic stage?
Well, look, I'm very pleased to see the changes in relation to the tariffs, but the challenge hasn't gone away, and I don't think this is a passing phase. I think we're living in a changing world. Now, for defence and security, we've already recognised that over recent months, which is why we increased defence spending, or why we've stepped up across Europe in relation to defence and security. We now need to do the same on trade and the economy, which has to be translated into, one, turbocharging our own economy, going further and faster with the changes that we need, which is why I announced what I did about Z mandates and electric vehicles on Monday, and about life sciences, reopening of Doncaster Airport. So doing more here in the United Kingdom, but also talking to international leaders about how we can lower trade barriers across the globe. Will make it easier for our businesses to thrive. But we've got to step up here on trade and economy in the same way that we've stepped up on defence and security.
You said a bit earlier in the week you didn't know if a deal could be done to get rid of the 10% tariffs on the UK. Are you any more confident now that that deal could be done with the US?
Well, our teams are talking, and we've got good relations. We are calm and pragmatic. The US is our closest partner on defence, security, intelligence, and of course huge amounts of trade. But I'm clear in my own mind that on its own will not alleviate the challenge. It's bigger than that, and that's why we've got to step up and turbocharge our own economy. And I want to be a government that's active, that's on the pitch, sleeves rolled up, working with our businesses, working with our communities, and delivering for working people across the country.
On a separate topic, some of your MPs are concerned about whether the government's doing enough to look into the scandal of grooming gangs. Can you promise that any area that needs an inquiry will be made to have one?
Well, my approach to this, and I've been dealing with grooming gangs for a very long time. I prosecuted the very first case that was ever brought to court, so I know this issue very well, and it's very serious. First thing I'd say is, if there's evidence of grooming, the first thing that should happen is the police should be involved, investigating, if appropriate, prosecuting, and then getting people in before a court, and if they're guilty, into prison. So that's my number one route. Of course, I accept the argument that there should be wider inquiries. There have been a number of inquiries. We've had hundreds of recommendations. We've had a national inquiry with 22 recommendations. My strong belief is we've got to implement those recommendations. At the moment, and under the last government, they just stacked up and sat on a shelf. So they need to be implemented. We're now implementing the recommendations from the national inquiry. 17 of them we're taking forward. Of course, if there's further local inquiries that are needed, then we put some funding behind that, and they should happen. But I don't think that simply saying we need more inquiries when we haven't even acted on the ones that we've had is necessarily the only way forward. I think that what we can't have is inquiry after inquiry, reports sitting on shelves, recommendations not implemented. Let's get on and implement the recommendations we've already got.
But you're still committed to local inquiries where necessary, because some are worried that you're watering that down.
No. We put the money behind it. We're not watering it down. We're committed to that. But I'm equally committed to implementing the recommendations that we've got. They were sitting on a shelf under the last government. And if you are at the most important level, if there's evidence of grooming that is coming to light now, we need a criminal investigation. I want the police investigating, because I want perpetrators in the dock, and I want justice delivered.
So I think on tariffs, you're right, the strategy here is still to sort of try and say as little as possible about every twist and turn coming from the Oval Office. Part of that, I guess, is not provoking a row when you've got talks going on between the US and the UK to try and get a carve-out from those 10% blanket tariffs. But will it work? Well, the UK is now finding itself in a similar position in terms of the reciprocal tariffs to the EU, when the EU's adopted a very, very different tone in terms of threatening retaliation on tariffs, and also just in their rhetoric and their language as well. In terms of where those US-UK talks are, I think maybe Keir Starmer was quite honest earlier in the week when he said, we just don't know whether we'll be able to do it, really. I mean, one of Trump's economic advisors said earlier there would need to be a pretty extraordinary deal to get someone a carve-out, so we shall see. I think the one big takeaway from that, though, is that the Prime Minister believes even if you can get a deal, and even with this backtracking from President Trump, it doesn't necessarily change the calculation domestically when it comes to economic growth and when it comes to the government strategy for trying to make the country more economically resilient and, of course, making the country more resilient when it comes to defence and security as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And you were also asking him about grooming gangs. That's another story we've been talking about today because, I mean, he's at pains to say that they haven't watered down their plans for local inquiries.
Yeah, this stems from a statement that Jess Phillips gave on Tuesday, where she was essentially updating MPs about the work the government's doing to assist with local areas that want to hold extra pieces of work, inquiries or other formats of work, if you like, to tackle or to try and find out about grooming gangs. Now, I think some MPs were a little bit concerned because there didn't seem to be as much emphasis in that statement on these 5 locally led but government-backed inquiries. And I think the issue was it came on top of a period where a few weeks ago, one of the senior lawyers that was supposed to be involved in all of this work had cast doubt on some of the communication he'd got from the government. And frankly, it's clearly a really serious issue, but politically, a lot of areas and a lot of MPs in certain Labour areas have got reform breathing down their neck on them on this as well. So I think they wanted to be able to tell concerned constituents and point to tangible progress. And I think the statement from Jess Phillips on Tuesday, just before Easter break, just before MPs went away for Easter, sort of set a few alarm bells ringing. I thought what was interesting about Keir Starmer there is you got a sense that he still believes the best way to tackle this primarily is through the police and the justice system, and is not necessarily to just go announcing more inquiries as the sort of golden bullet to this, the silver bullet to this, that actually there are other ways to tackle it, implementing recommendations from previous probes as well. Behind the scenes, the Home Office is really embarking on a sort of reassurance exercise, I think, saying, look, when Baroness Casey's national audit comes back, we may have more than 5 public inquiries. That's going to come back shortly after Easter. And Jess Phillips has also been talking to worried MPs in the last 24 hours as well. So I think it's a case of bad communication here and a little bit of mismanagement. And when it comes to a really serious topic like this, where a lot of people, are very quickly trying to make political points out of it and score political points, something like this needs to be managed really sensitively and carefully, and maybe that's gone awry in the last few days in government.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob. Right, let's bring Tom and Praful in. We'll talk to you in a moment about grooming gangs. We're going to be talking a bit more about that in the programme. But first, I want to ask you about, it's been a bit of a whirlwind 48 hours, I have to say, doing this show every night because things are changing so quickly. But, Tom, to start with you, what's your take on how this government are dealing with this? They're saying calm, but actually we're now at the baseline 10% with everyone else.
Well, what's clear
apart
is
from China.
Well, quite. And to use a sort of well-used political phrase, nothing has changed in the sense of the situation with the United Kingdom over the course of the last 24 hours. That 10% tariff is still applicable. I'm not sure, candidly, that ministers could be doing much more in relation to this. This is a difficult situation. I think one of the reasons that we find this so shocking, actually, as viewers of politics, is the fact that this is so unorthodox. This is not like any other presidency that we've seen. It's not the way in which our politics is conducted in this country. I think this sort of focus on trying to negotiate is the right approach. There will be some difficult challenges in that. When you look at trying to get a free trade agreement with the US, agriculture will be an issue where I suspect there will be some very tough conversations had and quite significant US demands. Things like a deal around tech will also undoubtedly come into this. And I know that we would want a better situation to come about when it comes to automotives and to vehicles. So there's a lot at stake here and we do need some progress.
Praful, how far do you think Labour will go to get a deal with the US?
Well, I think it's right that they're trying to get a deal with America. The problem is the genie's out the bottle. America is now a fundamentally unreliable trade partner. Irrespective of whether Donald Trump takes fright of the markets, bond traders or the stock market, you can't trust anything he agrees anymore. He can change his mind at a moment's notice, and that means any deal that's struck, it is right to try and get one because we've got to put the British economy in the best possible position, but it may not be worth the paper it's written on. And in those circumstances, the government's got to be thinking about where it can build good relationships with more reliable, good people. And actually, I think that starts next month with the EU summit. They are our closest allies, the ones that have been stable through all of this. And this is a chance to reset and normalise relations and find trading partners that won't turn around and put tariffs on us. So, I think it requires a reset. I think it is right to try and make a deal. but it needs to come hand in hand with finding more reliable trading partners.
And Tom, on the escalating situation between the US and China, 45% is the current rate of the tariff, the number that it's risen to. I feel like I'm actually struggling to now comprehend these numbers. They're just going up and up. What did I say? Did I say 145?
You said 45. I think
sorry,
it's
I meant 145. Now, yeah. I heard that in my ear. Tom, what would that mean for the UK if we did see a big trade war?
But it just doesn't do any of us any favours. And we've seen the sort of concern in the markets. And, there was clearly external pressure that President Trump was facing in terms of the markets, but clearly internal pressure playing into this on the political side, with perhaps even members of the cabinet voicing real concerns about where they were going. And undoubtedly, a lot of that links back into mortgage rates, which impacts upon people's disposable income. It plays into their well-being and various, other factors that are really important in all of this. So those issues cannot be insulated against. Those are the challenges. That is the backdrop. And I think all of us should be concerned about a trade war, because it clearly isn't in any of our interests to end up in that place on a sustained basis.
OK, thank you both. We're going to try to come back to you on this very soon. Well, there are lots of questions today over whether the president ultimately changed tack with his tariff after yields on US government bonds surged. Well, our business and economics correspondent Gurpreet Nargund's been taking a look through the numbers on the markets.
The bond markets finally blew the whistle on Donald Trump's game of chicken with the stock markets. First, they were down, then they were up. We've had a rout, a U-turn and a rebound. It's all been a bit breathless. So let's take a minute to find our bearings. This is the Nasdaq, one of the key indices on the US stock market. It's technology heavy, and it was hammered hardest by Trump's tariffs policy. After his Liberation Day announcement, it sank 4.5%, and it continued to plummet over the coming days. The Dow Jones and the S&P 500, well, they've been on a similar journey. Trillions of dollars were wiped off the US stock market in a matter of days. It was the sharpest downturn since the pandemic. And it went on like this for a week before the president finally hit pause on Wednesday afternoon. And he hinted at his plan a few hours earlier, posting on social media that this is a great time to buy. Well, the administration is now facing calls for an investigation into insider trading because of what unsurprisingly followed. Stocks surged, the Nasdaq up 12.16%, its largest one-day jump in 24 years. So some relief in the markets. But by Thursday, the US stock markets were faltering, the Nasdaq giving up some of those gains, a reminder that Trump's tariff agenda is still weighing on markets, and he's done nothing to settle the uncertainty damaging investor confidence. And we can see that playing out in other markets across the world too. The FTSE up sharply on Thursday, but giving up some of those gains by the afternoon. And in China, the Shanghai Composite Index still down 3.9%. since Liberation Day. And trouble still in the bond markets. They've played a big role here. Investors started dumping bonds at the start of the week, causing yields or government borrowing costs to soar. It was the highest three-day climb since the pandemic. The pressure on Donald Trump became unsurmountable. A U-turn followed. But look at this. Bond markets are still circumspect. Yields have come down, but they're still higher than they were a few weeks ago. So the volatility may have eased, but markets are still stressed. This isn't going to be smooth sailing.
Gurpreet Nargund reporting there. Well, the ongoing fallout from Trump's tariffs is one of the stories that is sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the editor of The Courier in Dundee, David Clegg, and the former Conservative Special Advisor, Anita Boateng. I'm pleased to say joining me now is someone I'm sure many of you will recognise, the former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng.
Hello.
Thanks so much for coming on the Politics Hub this evening.
Great to be here.
You learned the hard way.
Well, I've been here before.
Yeah, what happens when the markets turn on you? Do you think the comparisons this week are fair?
I think they're fair. I think he's gone full maximalist in the way that we did. And what he's trying to do is essentially reshape the world order. And he's taken the view, I'm sure he got advice against that, to just do everything at once, to create maximum disruption, and then now he's rowed back. I think you're right to say that the bond market as was the case in my and Liz Truss's experience, that was the key, because that's going to be pushing up mortgage rates for his base. I don't think he's that interested.
So you think that's what made him backtrack?
I think the last chart that you showed with the yields and all of that, I think that was critical, because I don't think he really minds about the stock market in the way that he would about the bond market, because that directly affects the government's ability to borrow, the federal government, and also mortgage rates in the US. But let's not do a lap of victory. We still have essentially a trade war with China. The tariff rates on China are 145%. They could go up further. I'm hearing things that suggest that he could ramp that up. And a full-scale tariff war, trade war between the US and China. Forget about everything else. A war between those two powers on trade will have an adverse effect on the global economy, and I think will very much drag Europe down, and possibly us as well, because you've got to remember that Europe, particularly Germany, exports a lot to China. So anything that's adversely affecting China will affect Europe's ability to export to China, and therefore European and UK GDP.
And on that, the governments say they're keeping to their fiscal rules. Do you think they should be doing that?
I think it's going to be very difficult, because given the uncertainty, I think the OBR will almost certainly revise down their growth forecasts for 2026 and 2027. We've got to remember they're, I think, 1.9% for 2026, 1.8% growth they're predicting in 2027. And if they revise those numbers down, the Chancellor will have to find more money, essentially, to pay for public services. And she'll have that invidious choice as to whether to cut public spending or increase taxes. And she could probably do a bit of both. Now, what you're asking about is the fiscal rules, which will sort of open up a whole can of worms, potentially, because the very bond markets that are that judged my budget, that judged Donald Trump, will also potentially be judging her and the Labour government if they decide to rip up their fiscal rules and just borrow more money.
So you think she should break those fiscal rules?
No, I don't think she should. But I think it's a challenging thing for her to do. And she should probably, I think, try and reduce spending. But I don't think the political appetite on the Labour benches will necessarily be there. So it's a very difficult choice. But if the OBR do revise down, they haven't revised down the forecast, but if they do, given the uncertainty, given the looming slowdown, I think it'll create huge problems for the government.
I guess, the truth is, Kwasi, I think people will be watching this, throwing things at the screen, saying, should we be interviewing you about the global economic situation after what happened? But, did you learn lessons, and do you think...
But I've lived through it. I know, I've lived through... there are very few people who've done that, and I'm looking at this thinking, this is déjà vu all over again, as the man said. I think... but he's in a different position to Liz Truss, because he's a president. There's no way they can get rid of him.
Does it make you think that maybe you and Liz Truss could have survived what's happening now?
I don't want to relive that. But I think in a parliamentary system, a leader, a prime minister, is more vulnerable because they've got to bring colleagues on side than a US president. He's got his 4 years, and nothing can prevent that, short of death or impeachment. Nothing can curtail his stint, or his second term as president.
Do you think it's right that the bond market get to dictate at this level in the US and the UK?
Well, I think it's surprising that they do that in the US. We're a much smaller economy than the US. But it's striking to me that even in the US, with the dollar, with the huge size of their economy, bond traders have that influence. I've no doubt that that's what really forced him, I think, to backtrack. Now, of course, he'll never admit that he's retreating. He'll claim victory, he'll claim success. But that's clearly what's happened, is that the people around him have taken fright of what's going on in the bond market, and that's why he's backtracked.
Praful, you're a Labour councillor. Let's bring our panel back in, Tom and Praful. Is there anything you'd like to ask Kwasi Kwarteng on the panel? Not to put you on the spot.
Will you say sorry to the public?
No, look, I've said we've gone through this a gazillion times.
I think there's something that's worth saying, is that I think, as you reflected there, it was thought impossible that what happened to this country when you were Chancellor could happen to America, given its position in the global economy. Now, they call it the moron premium, the kind of the challenge that the bond traders make to decisions like this. And, let's be frank about it. the decisions you made and Liz made were moronic, and Trump's decisions are of the same character. And we should be angry about it. And we should be angry about it not just because of stock markets falling and damage to global GDP growth, but because this is going to damage living standards around the world. And this is single-handedly being done, and we have to recover as a world to find new solutions because the global order has been smashed to pieces.
And the question?
Well, another question. No, I can't ask another one.
What do you make of that?
Well, look, if you're going to try and change the status quo, there are risks in that. And clearly we've seen that. I saw that in 2022, October 22, and I think Donald Trump has done the same. But I think with Trump, I think he'll be happy with the fact that he's still got this trade war with China. I mean, as your panel said, we're not out of the woods. There's still a full-scale trade war with China, and that's ongoing. He didn't reduce the tariffs there, and if anything, he'll be looking, I think, to increase them.
I've got a slightly more niche question about the Office for Budget Responsibility, which you brought up earlier, because the Prime Minister this week said he struggles with the way that they've analysed his welfare reforms. Do you think, you and Liz Truss were always quite cynical about the Office for Budget?
I think sceptical.
Sceptical is probably the right word.
So look,
do you think he's coming around to your way of thinking?
Well, look, I think now he's in government and he's got to actually solve the problems. The OBR scoring will not help the government generate growth, because the way they score tax measures, if you try and reduce taxes, you've got to either reduce spending or increase taxes elsewhere. And what they'll say, if they revise down the figures, they'll say to the government, you've got to raise 20, 30 billion pounds or whatever it is. And then the government will have to probably raise taxes. And the problem we were trying to solve in 22 was that if you raise taxes continually, you're not going to get any growth. So it's all very well, we can score political points, but over 3, 4, 5 years, if the economy is essentially flatlining, it'll become more and more difficult to pay for public services.
And I also want to ask you, while we've got you, we've had this YouGov poll this week about who would make the best leader, and Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservatives, came fourth after Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Nigel Farage and Ed Davey. What do you think is going wrong for her?
Look, I think it's a very difficult inheritance. The Conservative Party was roundly defeated, suffered its huge defeat. 6 months afterwards, or 8 months even, I think it's difficult to judge. I mean, I remember Keir Starmer, when they lost the Hartlepool by-election, which was about a year after he became leader, people were asking for his head. They were saying this is not working. The fact that the Tories won in Hartlepool is a total indictment on his leadership. And they won the next by-election, I think it was Hayward and Middleton, by 300 votes. If they'd lost that, he'd have been out. And these things are very finely balanced. So I'm not saying that Kemi Badenoch is out of the woods. I am saying that she has a bit more time. And if you look back at the last Parliament, Keir Starmer was in a very weak position, a year after the 2019 general election.
OK, thank you so much, former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, for coming on the programme this evening. We really appreciate it. You're watching The Politics Hub. Coming up, the Prime Minister insists that government plans for local inquiries into grooming gangs aren't being watered down, but tells Sky News that a statutory national inquiry into the issue isn't needed. We'll have the details next.
In the last 5 years, more than 13,000 farmers have left agriculture in the UK.
Is it going to be viable for the future?
No farmers, no food! The frustration, the anger, the fact that so many of them are at risk of going bust has now become too much.
You've got to keep hope, because one day it's going to be OK.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent.
It's scary what's happening in the country.
It's the illegal migrants that we don't want here.
How difficult is this to police tonight? Off the scale. Having the police speak to us so starkly right in the middle of the riot showed just how serious the situation was.
The water on board the barge contaminated with Legionella bacteria, an outbreak that was first revealed by Sky News.
There have been questions for months over whether the support offered to asylum seekers on the Bivvy is sufficient.
A cruel place to put human beings.
From busy cities to rural communities, we spend every day reporting on how big decisions impact real people. The last smoke and steam rises into the sky above Blast Furnace 4.
Today is a day in history in Talbot.
The closure means more than 2,000 job losses.
It just seems madness.
It is a highly contagious infection. South West Water did apologise again.
This is the Revenge Porn Helpline.
They're helping terrified victims.
You've been a victim of a very common type of online crime known as sextortion.
We're making things better for people.
Stonehenge became the latest victim of Just Stop Oil.
Now I can say I've been to the orange Stonehenge.
Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Hello, welcome back. Now, after confusion and a growing backlash, the Prime Minister has insisted that the government's plans for local inquiries into grooming gangs are not being watered down. Both the Conservatives and Reform UK have been accusing ministers of dropping a commitment for them to be held in 5 areas. But today, there was more clarity from the Home Secretary. They will be going ahead. Here is our Home Editor, Jason Farrell.
I didn't even know my dad still had this, though. That's why it's a bit weird, you know, looking at it.
Scarlett's dad kept multiple files recording what he believed was a failure of agencies to protect his daughter when she was a teenager. She would continually go missing after being groomed and trafficked for sex. 2 years ago, Scarlett waived her anonymity to tell her story to Sky News. But today, Marlon says his daughter is still being failed by a lack of decisive action from the government.
My daughter, Scarlett, has been let down by local authority, by the social workers, by the police force, and then when you think it gets to the level it has done, with the government, she's just been let down again. That's what's cruel.
The political row over grooming gangs was triggered by a few tweets from Elon Musk at the beginning of the year. And it re-emerged after a statement to the House from Jess Phillips was interpreted by many as the government rowing back on a promise to hold 5 local inquiries into grooming gangs. The Home Secretary spent much of this morning insisting the 5 inquiries will go ahead, if not more. The Prime Minister added that more important still is to implement recommendations from the previous independent inquiry into child sexual abuse.
We're now implementing the recommendations from the national inquiry. 17 of them we're taking forward. Of course, if there's further local inquiries that are needed, then we put some funding behind that and they should happen. But I don't think that simply saying we need more inquiries when we haven't even acted on the ones that we've had is necessarily the only way forward.
The opposition says it will look to force a vote in Parliament to have a national statutory inquiry.
We have been trying to get cross-party support. Labour MPs are being heavily leaned on by their whips, by the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary. I don't think that is right, so we're going to force another vote. We'll try and get as many Labour MPs to vote with us, but this is a matter for them. The public will see who is on their side when we have another vote on getting a national inquiry.
Home Office Minister Jess Phillips has been holding meetings with backbench Labour MPs to try and reassure them that nothing is being watered down. But the truth is we won't really know the government's full plan on this until a rapid audit that they've commissioned by Baroness Louise Casey comes back in a month or so. The government's statement to the House, timed just before the Easter break, has pretty much ensured this will be back on the agenda when MPs return. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Let's bring our panel back in, shall we? Tom and Praful. Tom, you, of course, were a Home Office Minister. What do you make of how this has all played out? I mean, the government have confirmed that there are going to be these 5 inquiries. Has this been kind of over-egged by the media?
I think the problem here is that ministers know that the approach to this is inadequate. And the fact that they announced this, snuck this out in the dying minutes of Parliament sitting before the Easter recess speaks volumes about the fact that they know this to not be enough. And I really worry about the message that this sends to victims, who I feel are being buffeted around in a massive political row about all of this at the moment. What they want is the truth, and that is perfectly right and understandable. People who've been to hell and back with those awful experiences that we've all heard about and that the media has rightly been shining a light on. All of the things that the Prime Minister mentioned in the clip earlier that Rob was talking to, he's right to be taking forward those things. But ultimately, the overall package is inadequate because we do need a statutory independent inquiry on a national basis to look at those communities that have been affected by this, with all of the powers to compel witnesses, with all of the proper resourcing around this, but also to be able to look at joining the dots and identifying themes so that we can then take action to address the systemic issues that mean that young women and girls who've been treated in the most horrific way that anybody can imagine won't experience that in future. And of course, we want to bring the perpetrators to justice as well.
The government would say to that Professor Alexis Jay did a national independent inquiry.
So what I'd say on that is that was a much broader inquiry around child sexual abuse. Really important recommendations came from that. I'm pleased that the government's actually announced they're going to get on and do those. I think that is something that is very welcome, and we should respect that and say so. And I would hope that my colleagues in Parliament who are still there would want to be supportive in driving that agenda forward now. But I don't think people like Sir Trevor Phillips are the sort of people who overreact. And I thought the fact that he came out yesterday and said that he thought that this was utterly, utterly shocking really spoke volumes about where we're at with this.
Praful, what do you think the mood is in your party about all this?
Well, look, I think first of all, you've got to start with the victims. And, I think it was Scarlett in your story and her father. It's harrowing what happened. It's harrowing if it's still happening, and it's got to be tackled. I think that when it's such a sensitive and important topic, it's really important that misinformation doesn't get spread. And there's clearly been a communication issue here because the inquiries are still happening. Baroness Casey's audit is still taking place. And actually, some of the central recommendations from the J report, which you mentioned, are being implemented, like the new agency, a report where recommendations weren't implemented under the last government. Having said all of that, and I think this would be shared by many people who are members of the Labour Party, given how important this issue is, given that there is still a widespread perception that it hasn't been fully investigated and been tackled, that actually all options should still be available, and that if more inquiries are needed, if things are found that need further investigation, that it does take place. But I think what we shouldn't do is get obsessed with process. What we need is change. And sometimes inquiries can take an awful long period of time before change starts to happen. And I think that's what people want to see more than anything.
The process matters in this because the outcome of this work has to have the confidence of victims. And I think there is an understandable anxiety and an understandable worry about, for example, local authorities marking their own homework on this issue. If you take seriously those concerns about conspiracy between different organisations, individuals who were on the payroll of certain organisations that would be scrutinised as part of this work, you can understand why victims who feel like they've been buffeted around really struggle to have confidence in these processes. So that really does matter, I would say. Having that kind of independent, impartial oversight of this work with all of the proper resourcing and being able to compel witnesses is so important.
It's obviously, as you both say, an incredibly important, sensitive issue. Has it been politicised a bit, Praful?
Well, look, I worry, especially since the intervention of Elon Musk, or was it a couple of months ago, that this issue has, unfortunately, been politicised when actually it does require, cross-party consensus on we need to get change to happen, because it was an injustice. It's a deep injustice, and it has to change. We've got to make sure there's the right set of inquiries to make sure that happens. But clearly, the inquiries they announce are still happening. And so quickly, people begin to believe otherwise. And that's a dangerous facet of our politics if we can't even agree on a common truth anymore. So I think that's very important we keep mindful of that.
Is your party guilty of politicising this at all, do you think?
I don't think so. I think that, Kemi, as the leader of our party, has spent time with victims and feels very strongly about this. And I think she's been very precise in saying what we would do in these circumstances. Obviously, there was a bit of reference there back to our time in government. I think the steps that we took during our time in office were important ones in terms of trying to shine a light on this, that wider work around child sexual abuse. But in recent months, we've heard really harrowing stories that I think add additional context to this, that does need that further scrutiny, that does need that further investigation, And that does mean that we get to the truth so that victims can fully understand what's happened and then believe that justice is being delivered to respond to what's happened to them, which is absolutely harrowing.
OK, thank you both very much. We'll come back to you very shortly. You're watching the Politics Hub coming up. The bid to save British steel carries on. I'll be speaking to the Chief Executive of the Northern Powerhouse Group about the future of the blast furnace in Scunthorpe. Hello, welcome back. Now, talks to secure the future of British steel are ongoing as fears mount over the company's plant in Scunthorpe. The Chinese owner of the plant has cancelled future orders for iron ore, coal and other raw materials needed to keep the furnaces running. Well, I'm pleased to say joining me now is Chief Executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, Henri Murison. Hello, Henri. Thank you so much for talking to us on the Politics Hub this evening. How hopeful are you that a deal will be reached?
I believe the government has a credible strategy for the steel industry. And what that means is that tactically, they have, I think, a strong offer to make to Jingye, who are the owners, which is that they want to work with Jingye. They want to produce steel in the UK, as the owners do, in a economically and an environmentally sustainable way. And I have every confidence that Jonathan Reynolds, having kind of taken charge of this situation since he took office only a few months ago, has made significant progress. We need to make sure that by the end of tomorrow, we do get an order made, because I think we are now at a point where time is genuinely running out. I think if the government is to play a significant role in underpinning that, that is a good thing, because it gives optionality.
Do you think that's minutes or hours for that deal?
I think my understanding is that we've probably got until the end of tomorrow to see an order being made. And I know that the government is aware of both that and the options for running one blast furnace and keeping another one to an extent in abeyance, which is also technically feasible. So I have every confidence that the government is acting in the best interests, not only of the steelworkers of Scunthorpe, but of UK PLC that needs to retain for as long as possible. And I would hope, if there is a technical solution, virgin steel making permanently, and whatever happens, some form of steel making here at Scunthorpe.
The government have made quite clear that nationalisation is still on the table. Is that something you'd support?
I support the government making the best deal for British taxpayers. So if Jingye want to invest private money in converting to blast furnaces, to electric arc furnaces, for example, then the total cost of that deal would be about 2 billion, of which the government would make up about a quarter of that funding package. If the UK government was to nationalise it in its entirety, then of course the recourse to public funds would be greater. There is a finite amount of funding for the government steel strategy, and I'm not in the business of spending the government's money willy-nilly here in the north of England and denying the government the opportunity to make and have an impact on other parts of the UK. So my view would be, if there is a commercial arrangement, and I think that Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, as part of the breakfast media round earlier this week, alluded to the fact that that was the government's preference, then clearly that would reduce the exposure to taxpayers. And I would favour that option if it's at all possible. I do, however, think that having the option of bringing this back into state ownership is the right thing. It is, of course, the case that the last government did at one point de facto nationalise this, but then chose to sell it again. The last government also failed to build the carbon capture infrastructure that would have allowed this plant to sustainably stay open and to start having a solution to decarbonise earlier, which would have given Jingye a lot more confidence to invest. And although those like Reform, for example, have called for nationalisation this week, they also oppose technologies like carbon capture, which are vital to the steelworks' long-term future. So I do think it's easy for some, perhaps in the context of the current mayoral election, to curry favour with the electorate they would perceive locally by throwing around ideological solutions on ideological grounds. I have no problem with a Chinese company owning the steelworks. I think if this company, who've been treated pretty badly by the last government, are prepared to still invest, I would welcome their investment. And the fact that the government's prepared to come in alongside them, I think is a good deal. We've heard a lot this week about deal making from other parts of the world. And I hope here in Scunthorpe, certainly with cooler heads like Jonathan Reynolds rather than the US president, it's very possible to make a deal with this Chinese business and for them to be part of the future of Scunthorpe. But if for whatever reason that isn't possible, I would support the government in pursuing alternatives.
So it sounds like you basically think it's been politicised. But you also talk about Donald Trump and what's going on in the US. I wanted to ask you about that while we've got time as well. Are you worried about the impact that tariffs are going to have on your region?
I think there's been some interesting work done by CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Studies, and others, which has shown there are some regionally significant impacts. Clearly, the manufacturing sector here in the north of England, as well as in the West Midlands, is very significant. In the northeast, in South Yorkshire, for example, but also in the northwest as a whole, manufacturing is key to our economy. So obviously, I'm concerned about those 10% tariffs. I'm particularly concerned about those tariffs on automotives at a higher rate. And I think what I would hope is that as part of the negotiations which the president is having with those countries that perhaps were getting higher tariffs, that for those jurisdictions like ours that might be pursuing a trade deal in services, which obviously would benefit other parts of the UK as well as here in the north, and could potentially bring significant benefits to London and the Greater South East, that some potentially particular exemptions on the automotive side could be particularly helpful. We're very lucky to have JLR plants here in the northwest as well as in the West Midlands, over in the Liverpool City region. We're also very lucky to have our friends making Bentleys in Cheshire, which is a phenomenal facility, making incredible motor cars, many of them for export, including to the US. So I would hope that the government will bear in mind the need to address the tariff issues as part of our wider relationship with the US. And again, I would say that I think, like many business organisations as we have quite a bit of confidence, again, that the Business Secretary, Jonathan, is listening to all of us and has the best interests of regions like the north of England and for example, the North West at heart. And Jonathan, I think, does understand these issues. So he will have the support of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership on getting us a better trade deal as well as on steel. And I think the fact that he is engaging so positively with the business community, and as is the wider government, is exactly how they should be behaving in response to this. This is a challenge to all of the UK, not just to the political establishment and business leaders, including myself and many here in the North.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Henri Murison from Northern Powerhouse Partnership. It's always good to talk to you on the Politics Hub. Still to come on the Politics Hub. With new stamps being introduced to make sure people don't miss their NHS appointments, we'll take a look back at some other memorable special stamps from across the years. Yes, really, don't go away.
I'm Deborah Haynes, Sky Security and Defence Editor.
The reality of life under Russian fire.
People don't want to leave even though help is here to evacuate them. They say they want to sort out their belongings first. It's absolute chaos.
Fire, shouts the commander. There's a dash to safety as Russian drones will be trying to find this position.
We've now got to wait inside the shelter to see if there is incoming. I've been covering Russia's full-scale war since it began, witnessing the terror and the trauma.
When rockets fall, I try to hide my head under my toys.
Illustrating Ukraine's lost childhood. Hopes and dreams framed by war.
Conflict in the Middle East is another major focus.
An incredibly dangerous moment.
We saw the missiles streaking across the sky. We saw the intercept going up, and then we saw the explosions when the intercepts were successful. With global threats rising, I also explored defence and security in the UK and across NATO.
This US aircraft carrier is operating in European waters in a deliberate show of force.
This is routine training for NATO, but should Russia's war with Ukraine escalate significantly, pilots like these could be called upon to go into combat for real.
Tucked away in the National Archives are some of the UK's old defence plans.
The scale of this bunker underlines how seriously governments took the threat of nuclear attack and global conflict. Should allies listen to Vladimir Putin's sabre-rattling?
No, they shouldn't, and they don't.
Sky News, the full story first.
The Premier League run-in is live on NBC and Peacock with the final sprint for European qualification. That is massive! Saturday, it's North versus West in a London showdown. Arsenal secured bragging rights in the first meeting. Superstar for Arsenal. But Brentford are looking to make European history. This is the Premier League run-in, live on NBC and streaming on Peacock.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, I think we all know the frustration of a late postal delivery. The clothes you need for that big event don't arrive on time. Someone's birthday card arrives long past the date. But it's even more crucial that a letter arrives on time when it's from our National Health Service. So now a new barcode system on stamps will be introduced to automatically separate and process NHS letters in a bid to cut down on missed appointments. And we couldn't resist in our morning meeting today the opportunity to run through some stamps, historic stamps. This is a new NHS stamp that we've just been talking about here, which I hope is going to navigate around any postal crises. This stamp has obviously got a very specific purpose, but it's far from the first stamp to have a special design. So we thought we'd look back at some other stamps. Here we go. I think you can probably recognise who all these people are. Margaret Thatcher, Winston Churchill, Clement Attlee. There we go. Panel. I'm not sure what the question is, but what are either of you stamp collectors?
Sadly not.
No, same here. I'm not a stamp collector, but I do like sending letters. I'm a big fan of letters.
And people do get very frustrated with the postal service in this country, don't they?
You get a few complaints about the postal service as a constituency MP, but, actually I think it's pretty remarkable that you can post a letter somewhere in the country and it gets to someone the next day, and that's a really important service for people.
And I should add that these next ones aren't actually real. This is the official NHS stamp, but could it have been different given the Health Secretary is now taking control of NHS England? There we go. Look, this was... I'm actually going to name and shame this. Is Daryl, our editor, making this today.
He's looking very fit and well.
That could kind of be anyone, but that is
Steve
Wes
Carell,
Streeting.
not quite sure.
And the politics team have been given been getting a bit creative. I'm told this next one. Oh God.
True to life.
I told them not to do this. I think that is meant to be me. You know what? It could have been worse. Yeah, that's all right. And Tom, I think you sent in your suggestion for who you'd like to see on a stamp.
The
there
bionic
we go.
MP.
Yes.
What a remarkable man in our politics. When you think about everything Craig's been through, he symbolises everything that I think you want in your politicians.
This is
resilience and determination. And
Craig McKinley, former Conservative MP who lost his legs and arms from sepsis, and it's a very good choice, ending on quite a serious note there for our stamps. Thank you both so much for talking to us on our panel this evening and for bearing with us on a slightly interesting story at the end there. There wasn't that much fun in the morning meeting, so we thought it'd be fun to have a look at some of those stamps. Thank you so much for watching. We will be back next week, next tonight, Sarah Jane Mee.